The third is to give his Jewish audience perspective on how and why to follow him.
And lastly, to give his Jewish audience perspective on why they should not follow the Pharisees. So this parable, Jonathan, while it seems like a simple enough story, based on the kind of things that would happen in their daily lives, was a very pointed lesson that the Jews he was speaking to needed to hear.
Mm-hmm.
Folks, if you have a thought, it's 860-442-9956, 860-442-WXLM.
Well, Rick, that begs the question, why sheep and a shepherd?
Okay, yeah, why would Jesus use that particular type of analogy? Well, first of all, it's a sensible analogy. But secondly, there's more reason than just that. Why would that be?
Why don't we read Ezekiel 34, verse 23. I will set up one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them. Even my servant David, he shall feed them, and he shall be their shepherd.
Okay, and read also Ezekiel 37:24.
And David my servant shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments, and observe my statutes, and do them.
So there are prophecies in the Old Testament that talk about, now it says, my servant David shall feed them. Now, David had died already.
Yes.
And oftentimes in Scripture, when you have something like that being talked about, it's talking about his lineage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So now what you're saying is, and remember that the Messiah was promised to come from the seed of who?
David.
So, in Ezekiel, you're saying this Messiah will be a shepherd over them.
Yes.
So, why the analogy of sheep and shepherd? Well, because the Old Testament put that context in place where everyone would be able to understand it. Now, of all of the people that would have been listening at this point, who do you think would have best known the Old Testament Scriptures?
The scribes and Pharisees.
Right. So Jesus is giving this parable in language that they would be somewhat familiar with, because it's using something that they're familiar with both in their everyday life and in their scriptural understanding. So I think, Jonathan, that's a great question you asked, why sheep and a shepherd? And the answer is because the Bible tells them to teach it that way. The Old Testament tells them.
It's a prophecy, and it's being fulfilled.
Exactly. And again, not only does that show the power of God's Spirit in Jesus, but it shows how Jesus was so attuned with the fulfillment of the Old Testament.
You got it.
He took all of these opportunities, and he saw the prophecies coming to light, and he did what was necessary to put them in place. So what a great, this sends kind of shivers up my spine when I think about it. So let's talk, Jonathan, for a couple minutes now. In this parable, you have the sheepfold and the gates. Okay, and it talks about thieves and bandits. That's in our theme scripture. We're going to cover that part later. But the commentator Barnes, just a couple of lines from what he describes in terms of a sheepfold.
The sheepfold was an enclosure made in fields where the sheep were collected by night to defend them from robbers and wolves.
Okay, so it was like a fenced-in area. That's what it was. It was a fenced-in area where you brought the flock so they could be protected from the outside elements, from thieves, from being eaten, and so forth and so on. So it was a very sensible thing. Everybody understood it. Everybody knew about it. Now, let's try and figure out, because Jesus talks about the sheepfold, what could that possibly mean? What was a protective measure for the nation of Israel? Let's take a look at Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 7.
My point is this: heirs, as long as they are minors, are no better than slaves, though they are the owners of all the property. But they remain under guardians and trustees until the date set by the father. So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child. And if a child, then also an heir through God.
Okay, now there's a very important line in there right at the beginning of verse 5. It talks about Jesus was sent to redeem who?
Those who were under the law.
Okay,
the
those
Jews.
who were under the law.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an important aspect because if we go back into ancient history, the law was given to the Jews, remember, after they were released from their bondage of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
The law was given to them to set them apart.
That's right.
It was given them to separate them from the other peoples of the world. It was given to them to be a standard by which they were to live. It was given to them to protect them from contamination, so to speak. And also, with that, if you remember, I think it's in, and I'm not positive about this, but I think it's in Leviticus 25 or Deuteronomy 25, or maybe not even either, I'm not sure. But there was a promise that if you keep the law, you can continue to live.
Yeah, live forever, that's right.
Right. So you have this law, the Jewish law was put in place to protect the people of Israel. It was God's law, put there to separate them, to keep them focused on things above, to keep them focused on God and not get all tied up in paganism, which was spreading throughout the rest of the world at this point in time.
Well, Rick, that really sounds to me like that's that fence that's guarding those sheep.
Well, and
that law.
It does seem to make sense, doesn't it?
It does.
Because first of all, the audience is entirely a Jewish audience. It's in the context of dealing with the Sabbath, and that law was put there as to separate them. I mean,
mm-hmm.
and you know, when you want to separate yourself from somebody else, if you don't like your neighbors, what do you generally do? You either put up a fence or you get a nasty dog.
Or both.
Yeah. So you put up a fence. Let's read Galatians 3:13 as well.
Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, for it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree."
So while the law, now this is kind of an interesting thing, while the law was there to protect them, it was also called a curse. Now why would that be?
Well, because no one was able to fulfill it up to that point in time, before Jesus, that is.
Right, and then Jesus comes along, and what's he do? He fulfills the law. So he released them from the curse of the law. So it's like, okay, you have the law in place, and now you have this, the only way out of the law is fulfillment of the law. Doesn't that make sense?
It does.
So it sounds like, to me, I mean, this is just a Rick thought here, but that this gate is the fulfillment of the law. Because that's the only way out of it. Because while it was a good law, there's no question about it, it was also a very, very strict and hard standard because it was there to expose what sin was. And the interesting thing is that Jesus, in the call of Christianity, teaches us to live by the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. So, Jonathan, let's go into a break at this point because I think it's about time. Folks, we're talking about the parable of the sheepfold and the shepherd and trying to figure out how to put the pieces together.
This is Jonathan and Rick with Christian Questions on News Talk 104.7 WXLM. Do you recognize his voice? We'll be right back.